Carson's hands shook as he stood in the doorway, staring in shock at his wife and her boss entangled in their marital bed. The dim light cast strange shadows over their faces as they jumped apart, fumbling with their clothes. The silence in the room was deafening. He took a step forward, his heart pounding, his mind trying to process the image burned into his memory. Is this a joke? Carson's voice cracked, straining to contain the surge of emotions. His voice echoed through the room, and he could feel his entire world crumbling beneath him. Marissa's boss, William, raised his hands defensively, as if to ward off an attack. Listen, Carson, it's complicated, he stammered, looking at Marissa as if she might step in to explain. Complicated? Carson's voice turned bitter. His eyes narrowed on Marissa. Tell me, Marissa, why would you do this? His gaze bored into her, searching for any hint of regret. Marissa didn't flinch. Her face was cold, almost defiant, as she met his gaze. Carson, I don't owe you an apology, she replied, her tone icy and unyielding. Accept it or get out. If you leave, you'll never see your kids again. Her words were like a slap in the face, and he took a step back, trying to process what she had just said. You're not even sorry. You don't regret a thing. His voice was softer now, almost pleading, as if he wanted to hear something, anything, that would make this nightmare go away. Marissa's expression hardened even further. No, I don't, she spat, glancing at William as if to solidify her stance. She crossed her arms and leaned into William's shoulder. William, he's different. He's successful. He understands me, and he's everything you'll never be. Carson felt a painful weight settle in his chest. His wife, the woman he had trusted and loved, stood there with no remorse, no guilt, just disdain. And this man, William, stood beside her with a smug, self-assured expression, as though he'd already won everything. I'll never be, Carson repeated, his voice hollow. You're willing to destroy our family over a fling with your boss? William finally spoke up, his tone condescending. Carson, you don't understand. Marissa needs someone who supports her. Maybe if you'd been there for her, she wouldn't have needed me. Carson clenched his fists, resisting the urge to retaliate. I was there, he said, his voice strained. Every day, I was there for her, for the kids, for our life together. William just smirked, shrugging as if Carson's words were meaningless. Carson turned to Marissa, hoping for some semblance of recognition, but her face was a stone wall. Suddenly, there was a rustle at the door. Carson's mother stepped into the room, her face stern and unbothered by the scene unfolding before her. Carson's heart lifted momentarily, thinking she would come to his defense, that maybe someone in his life would stand with him. Mom, he murmured, hoping for a lifeline. You knew about this. His mother's face tightened, and she crossed her arms, casting a judgmental gaze over him. Carson, she said, if you divorce Marissa over a tiny affair, you can never call me your mother again. Her tone was as cold as Marissa's, her words calculated. It's a small mistake that any woman could make. You should have noticed sooner if she was unhappy. The shock turned to pain, then anger. He took a deep breath, his voice filled with disbelief. Are you serious? You're blaming me? She didn't blink. Of course I am, she replied, her voice steady. You let her drift away, and now you're angry because another man came along and did what you couldn't. You should be grateful for the family you have, not throw it all away over your pride. Carson's mind reeled, his own mother supporting Marissa's betrayal as if it were a simple mistake. He looked between Marissa and his mother, searching for any flicker of remorse, but there was none. They both stood there unashamed, as if he were the one at fault. Marissa's voice cut through his thoughts. Maybe if you were half the man William is, we wouldn't be in this mess. She leaned into William, smirking, her eyes challenging Carson to say something, to react. Carson clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his composure. I loved you, Marissa. I gave you everything I had. She shrugged, her face unmoved. Love isn't enough, Carson. It takes more than that. William provides. He understands me. We're happy. Can you honestly say that we were happy together? For a moment, Carson was speechless. He looked at his mother, searching for any sign of compassion or understanding, but she just shook her head. Her eyes were cold. "This is your fault, Carson," she said, her tone sharp. "If you can't keep your family together, don't expect any sympathy from me. And don't you dare leave your kids without a full family." Carson felt his world crumbling. His wife, his mother, both turning on him, blaming him as if their betrayal was somehow his fault. In that moment, a painful realization washed over him. He was truly alone in this. "Fine," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "If this is what you all believe, then so be it." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. His body felt heavy, every step a struggle as he made his way down the hallway to his children's room. His mind was racing, but a single thought emerged from the chaos: his kids. He pushed open the door to their room, his heart breaking at the sight of them. His daughter was curled up in her bed, her soft breathing filling the room, while his son lay sprawled out, his small hand resting on his pillow. Carson felt a fierce protectiveness surge within him, a desperate need to shield them from the betrayal and pain that had shattered his world. He knelt by his daughter's bed, gently brushing a hand over her hair. She stirred, opening her eyes just a little, and he smiled softly, whispering, "Daddy's here, sweetheart. Daddy's here." She mumbled something incoherent before drifting back to sleep, and he felt a wave of sadness and determination wash over him. This wasn't the life he had imagined for them. They deserved better than lies and betrayal. As he rose, he took one last look at his children, his mind made up. He knew what he had to do. Whatever it took, he would protect them, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Early morning light streamed through the windows, casting a calm over the house. The emptiness felt surreal, almost peaceful. Carson knew that he didn't have much time before Marissa and his mother would return. Every second mattered, and he moved through the house swiftly, grabbing essentials for his children and himself. In the kitchen, he packed a small bag of snacks, water bottles, and their favorite toys. His hands moved mechanically, guided by a strange mix of clarity and numbness. He had made his decision, and now he only needed to act on it. As he quietly moved into his daughter Lily's room, she lay curled up under her blanket, her small hand tucked under her chin. Carson paused, watching her for a moment. He hated to wake her, but they had to leave now. He gently nudged her shoulder. "Lily," he whispered, brushing a stray hair from her face, "Sweetheart, time to wake up. We're going on an adventure." Lily's eyes fluttered open, still groggy. She squinted up at him, her mouth turning into a small smile. "Daddy," she murmured, stretching her tiny arms. "That's right, sweetie," he said softly. "It's early, but we're going somewhere special." She blinked at him, still sleepy but intrigued. Carson handed her a small backpack he had packed with her clothes, a few books, and her favorite stuffed bunny. She hugged it to her chest, yawning. "Will Man be there?" she asked. Carson paused, caught off guard. He knelt down, looking her in the eyes. "Not right now, Lily. It's just you, me, and your brother. We're going to have our own little adventure. Sound good?" Lily looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded, squeezing his hand. "Okay, Daddy." Carson led her quietly to the living room, where he'd already packed bags for each of them. He moved to his son's room next. 5-year-old Ethan was sprawled across the bed, his mouth slightly open as he slept. Carson lifted him gently, whispering, "Ethan, buddy, time to wake up." Ethan's eyes opened slowly, focusing on his father. "Where are we going?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "We're going somewhere fun, kiddo. Just trust me." Ethan wrapped his arms around his father's neck as Carson carried him to the living room. He set Ethan down to grab his small backpack, checking one last time that everything was packed. "Daddy, are we really going on an adventure?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Carson knelt down, giving his son a reassuring smile. "Yes, we are. It's going to be a new place where we can all be happy. You and your sister will love it." Ethan tilted his head, his expression serious. "Are you coming too?" Carson's throat tightened, but he nodded firmly. "Yes, buddy, I'm coming too. I'll be right with you both." Finally, he bundled them into the car, strapping them in as they looked around, half awake with curiosity. Carson took a deep breath, then started the car. He didn't glance back at the house, at the life he was leaving behind. This was a new beginning. As he pulled out of the driveway, his mind began to settle, his thoughts clearing with every mile that passed. There were no more traces of guilt or doubt, only a growing sense of determination. He was doing this for his children. The early morning roads were empty as they drove through town. His kids had drifted back to sleep in the back seat, their heads resting against their seatbelts. Carson glanced at them in the rearview mirror, feeling a fierce protectiveness. They were his reason for everything. Finally, he stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. He'd need fuel and a moment to clear his mind. As he filled the tank, he felt the weight of his actions, but the resolve held strong. When he returned to the car, he found Lily awake, watching him intently. "Where are we, Daddy?" she asked. He smiled gently, reaching over to brush a stray hair from her face. "Just a little stop, sweetheart. We're still on our way." "Can I have some snacks?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. "Of course," he said, reaching into one of the bags and pulling out a small packet of crackers. He handed it to her, then took a deep breath. "Listen, kids, I know things might seem confusing right now, but I promise everything is going to be okay." Lily nodded as she munched on her crackers, and Ethan stirred awake, rubbing his eyes. "Are we there yet?" he asked, looking around with a frown. "Almost, buddy," Carson assured him, though in reality, he had no final destination in mind. His main concern was to get far enough away to buy himself time and think through what was next. They drove for another hour, with Carson taking random turns to avoid any possibility of being followed. By mid-morning, they reached a small town that Carson remembered visiting with his parents years ago. It was quaint and quiet, with modest houses and a small downtown area. He pulled into a local park, thinking it would be a good place to let the kids stretch their legs and play while he gathered his thoughts. "All right, guys, we're here," he said, turning off the engine. "Let's go check out the park." They both scrambled out of the car, stretching and looking around with wide eyes. The park was mostly empty, save for a few morning walkers and families with small children. Carson took his kids by the hands, guiding them to the playground area. They ran off immediately, climbing up the play structures and laughing as they went down the slides. As he watched them play, Carson felt a sense of relief. Here, in this quiet little town, they were safe. He could figure out their next steps without the constant reminder of betrayal hanging over him. This could be a fresh start. "Daddy, look," Ethan called, pointing at the swing set. Carson smiled, walking over to push him, as Lily climbed onto the swing next to her brother. He pushed them gently, watching as their laughter filled the air. After a while, they returned to the car, tired and hungry. Carson handed out sandwiches and juice boxes, watching them eat. The day had stretched into an early afternoon, and he knew he'd need to find somewhere for them to sleep for the night. "Daddy," Lily asked suddenly, her brow furrowing, "are we going home tomorrow?" Carson took a deep breath, looking into her trusting eyes. "Lily, I don't think we're going back there," he said softly. "We're going to find a new home somewhere that's just ours. Would that be okay with you?" Lily looked down, her small hands fidgeting in her lap. After a moment, she nodded, her expression resolute. "As long as you're there, Daddy, I don't care where we go," Ethan chimed in, nodding. "Yeah, as long as we're all together." Carson felt his heart swell, a mix of pride and sadness. He leaned over, hugging them both tightly. "I love you both more than anything. This new life, it's going to be better, I promise." Later that day, they checked into a modest motel, a temporary stop while Carson made plans. He spent the night researching towns and schools, thinking of places where they could settle. He was resolute about keeping his children safe, and even though he had no definite plan, he felt a strange sense of peace for the first time in a long time. He felt hopeful as the children drifted to sleep in the motel bed. Carson watched over them, vowing to himself that he would protect this new family he was creating. No more lies, no more betrayals. Carson was barely a week into his new life, adjusting to the routines of single parenthood when his phone rang. The unfamiliar number blinked insistently on the screen, disrupting the quiet of the room where he sat watching his children play. His heart pounded as he reached for the phone, An unsettling feeling washed over him. "Hello," he said. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an urgency woven into her words. "Mr. Thompson?" The woman's voice was professional, but edged with something heavy. "This is Nurse Collins from Meadowfield Hospital. I'm calling to inform you that your wife and mother were in a serious car accident. Both are in stable condition, but require observation and treatment for their injuries." Carson's grip tightened on the phone. A chill spread through him. He fought to keep his voice steady, glancing at his kids playing with their toys, oblivious to the conversation. "Are they okay?" he asked. "Yes, they're both stable," the nurse continued. "But they're shaken, especially your mother. They've asked to see you." There was a pause before she added, almost gently, "I think it would help them to know you're nearby." Carson sat in silence, wrestling with a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of him felt a wave of concern, a natural reaction to the news, but the bitter memories of their betrayal crowded his mind. His mother, who had stood by Marissa's side, casting judgment on him. Marissa, who had shown him no remorse, no hint of regret. "Mr. Thompson," the nurse prompted gently, "will you be able to come?" Carson hesitated, his thoughts colliding. A large part of him wanted to shut the door on this chapter, to let them bear the consequences of their actions, but he knew this was not something he could ignore forever, not when his children were involved. He took a breath, glancing back at Lily and Ethan, who were busy building a fort with pillows and blankets. They deserved a mother, even a flawed one, and he owed it to them to find out what was going on. "Yes," he finally replied, his voice steady. "I'll be there soon." After hanging up, he sat down heavily, the weight of his decision pressing on him. How could he face them after everything? But he knew he couldn't hide the truth from his children. Gently, he approached them, kneeling down to their eye level. "Hey, kiddos," he began, mustering a reassuring smile. "We're going on a little trip. We need to visit Mommy and Grandma. They're at the hospital, but don't worry, they're going to be okay." Lily's face grew worried. "Why are they in the hospital, Daddy?" "They were in an accident," he explained gently. "But they're safe now. We're just going to check on them." Ethan's eyes grew wide. "Are they hurt?" "Not too badly, buddy," Carson reassured him, pulling both of them into a hug. "They just need some rest, and they'll be fine." The drive to the hospital was quiet, each mile closing the distance he had fought so hard to put between himself and the life he had left behind. The children stared out of the windows, seeming to sense the weight in the air. Finally, they arrived, and Carson parked outside, taking a deep breath before leading the children through the bustling corridors of the hospital. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the fluorescent lights made everything feel harsh and unwelcoming. At the reception desk, a nurse directed them to a room down the hall. Carson could feel his pulse quickening with each step as they approached the door. Carson caught sight of Marissa lying on the bed, her face pale and a cast on her arm. His mother sat beside her in a wheelchair, a few bruises visible on her face, her expression somber. "Carson," his mother's voice was softer than he'd ever heard it, a shadow of her usual sharp tone. She looked up at him, something vulnerable in her eyes. You came." He nodded, his face blank for the kids, replied quietly, his voice hardening despite his efforts to stay calm. "They deserve to know their mother is okay." Marissa looked away, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "Thank you for coming," she said, barely above a whisper. Carson nodded. "How did this happen?" His mother spoke up. "We were driving back from the mall when a car ran a red light. I didn't see it coming. Everything happened so fast." She took a shaky breath, her gaze flickering to Carson's children. "I'm grateful you're here. The family should be together in times like this." A bitter laugh almost escaped Carson's lips, but he bit it back. "Family," he replied, his voice dripping with irony. "You didn't seem too concerned with that when you told me to ignore Marissa's affair." His mother flinched, and Marissa turned her head, a flicker of shame crossing her face. "Carson, Marissa," she started, her voice hesitating. "I never meant for things to go this far. I didn't think you'd actually leave." "Why wouldn't I?" Carson's tone was cold. "You both made it perfectly clear that I was the problem. You didn't think I'd have enough self-respect to walk away." Marissa's eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought you would just accept it, that you'd stay for the kids. His mother cleared her throat, her gaze shifting between Carson and Marissa. Carson, she said softly, her voice pleading, maybe we were too harsh on you. I see that now. I was only trying to keep the family together. By enabling Marissa, by pushing me to accept betrayal, that's not family, Carson said, his jaw clenched. He took a steadying breath, glancing down at his children who were watching the conversation with wide, curious eyes. Family is loyalty, respect, and honesty, things you both seem to have forgotten. The room fell into silence, and Carson could feel the weight of his words settling heavily on them. His mother looked down, her face pale, while Marissa's eyes filled with tears. Carson, Marissa, she choked out, her voice raw, please let's talk. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I want to fix this. I don't want to lose our family. He looked at her, his face unreadable. You already made that choice, Marissa. I'm just living with the consequences. Marissa reached out, her voice breaking. Please, Carson, don't do this to the kids. They need both of us. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. He shook his head slowly, his face set. It's not that simple anymore. He turned to his mother, his tone sharp. You wanted me to stay with her, no matter what. You wanted me to keep quiet and accept betrayal, and now you think a few words will make it all better. His mother's lip trembled. Carson, I was wrong. I see that now. I don't want to lose you or my grandchildren. The children looked up at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Carson knelt beside them, putting his arms around their shoulders. Kids, he said softly, I want you to know that Daddy's always going to protect you, no matter what. Lily looked up at him with wide eyes. Are we leaving, Daddy? He smiled, brushing a hand through her hair. Yes, honey, we'll be going home soon. Marissa's voice wavered as she reached out. Carson, don't go. I'm begging you. We can start over. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. Carson straightened up, looking at her with a hard expression. Sometimes sorry isn't enough. He looked at his mother, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears. You both broke my trust, and that's not something I can forget. He took one last look at them, then turned to his children. Come on, kiddos, let's go home. As they left the hospital room, Carson felt a strange sense of relief. The hurt was still there, but he felt a clarity he hadn't felt in months. He had faced them, given them the chance to explain, but it changed nothing. He had chosen his path, and now there was no turning back. They stepped outside. The sun was bright and warm against their faces. He glanced down at his children, who held his hands tightly. Their trust in him was unshakable as they walked toward the car. Carson felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace. For the first time, he knew he was truly free. Carson's phone vibrated with a message that cut through the calm he had built around his new life. It was from Marissa, and her words were heavy with pleading. After days of silence, she was asking him to meet. He had expected her to reach out eventually, but he didn't anticipate the rush of emotions that came with seeing her desperate request. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, he stared at the message, turning it over in his mind. His rational side told him to ignore it. He didn't know her anything, but curiosity nodded at him, wondering what she could possibly say after everything that had happened. Finally, he agreed, arranging to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from familiar faces and places. When he arrived, Marissa and his mother were already there, sitting across from each other, their expressions tense and solemn. Carson paused by the doorway, taking in the sight of them. Marissa looked pale, almost haggard, her shoulders hunched as she stared down at her hands. His mother's face was drawn, her usual confidence replaced with a weary look he had never seen before. Their eyes met his as he approached, and he caught the flash of relief on both of their faces. Carson didn't greet them. He simply sat down, folding his hands on the table as he waited for one of them to speak. The silence was thick, and Marissa was the first to break it. Carson, she began, her voice barely a whisper, I I made a mistake. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I was wrong. I've been wrong about so much. Carson raised an eyebrow, his tone cold. Oh, so now it's a mistake? He leaned back, crossing his arms. Funny, I remember you telling me I had to accept it or get out, that it was my problem if I didn't like it. Does any of that sound familiar to you? Marissa's face flushed, and she looked away, swallowing hard. I was angry, she murmured. I thought you'd just accept it for the kid's sake. I didn't think you'd actually leave. I never meant for it to go this far. Carson clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. So it was fine to betray me and keep me around as long as it didn't inconvenience you. That was your plan? Marissa's eyes filled with tears, her hands shaking as she reached out across the table. Please, Carson, don't make this harder than it already is. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. I just want to make things right. Make things right? Carson's voice rose, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. How exactly do you plan to do that, Marissa? How do you make up for breaking someone's trust? At this, his mother leaned forward, her face a mix of shame and desperation. Carson, we both made terrible mistakes. I thought I was protecting the family by telling you to stay with her. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was only making things worse. Please, don't shut us out. I can't bear the thought of losing my son and my grandchildren. Carson turned to his mother, his eyes hard. You've already lost us, he replied flatly. You lost me the moment you sided with Marissa, telling me I was to blame for her cheating. You called me a failure, told me to accept it and keep quiet. And now that everything's fallen apart, you think a few words are going to fix it? His mother's eyes filled with tears. I was wrong. I see that now. I thought you'd forgive her, that things would go back to normal. Carson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Forgive her? Forgive both of you for betraying me, for thinking so little of me? He shook his head. There's no going back. I've moved on, and so have the kids. Marissa reached out, her voice breaking. Carson, please. We don't have to go back to how things were, but I want to try for the kids' sake. They need both of us. Carson's patience snapped. Now you care about the kids? He leaned closer, his voice low but seething. Where was this concern when you were sneaking around with your boss? When you were lying to me, disrespecting me in our own home? I was there for our kids every single day, and you threw it all away without a second thought. Marissa's hand fell back, and she covered her face, the weight of her regret finally crashing over her. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Carson, I'm so sorry. I know it's too late, but I didn't realize what I had until it was gone. Carson's gaze was unyielding. The only reason you're sorry is because you got caught, Marissa. If I hadn't walked in that night, you'd still be with him, wouldn't you? She looked away, unable to answer. His mother reached for his hand. Her voice choked with emotion. Please, Carson, don't turn your back on us. I know I failed you, but I love you, and I love my grandchildren. I want to be part of their lives. Carson looked at her hand on his, feeling a strange detachment. You pushed me away, Mom. You chose Marissa's side when you should have been there for me. You made me feel like I didn't matter, like my pain didn't matter. And now you're asking for forgiveness. He shook his head slowly, his voice calm but unyielding. You both made your choices. You both knew exactly what you were doing, and now you're suffering the consequences. Marissa's shoulders shook as she sobbed openly, her pride gone, replaced with desperation. Carson, please, just give me a chance to make things right. I'll do anything. I'll go to counseling. I'll change. I just don't want to lose you and the kids. Carson looked at her, feeling a pang of the love they once shared, but it was quickly overtaken by the memory of her betrayal, her cold dismissal. You already lost me, Marissa. The moment you looked me in the eye and told me to accept it or get out. You lost me, and I made my choice. Marissa looked up, desperation turning to panic. But the kids need their mother, Carson. They deserve a family. They have a family, he replied evenly. They have me, and I'm going to make sure they grow up in a home filled with respect, not lies and betrayal. He looked from her to his mother, both of them broken and pleading. but he felt nothing but a quiet sense of finality. I hope you both find whatever it is you're looking for, but my children and I are moving forward. Marissa tried one last time, her voice barely more than a whisper. Carson, I'll never stop trying. I'll prove to you that I can change. He met her gaze, his own unwavering. You had your chance, Marissa, and you threw it away. I'm done with that. He stood up, turning his back on them as they sat in silence, absorbing his final words. As he walked out of the cafe and back to his car, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The past was behind him now, and the future for him and his kids was waiting. Months passed, each day adding a quiet layer of peace over Carson's life as he rebuilt it piece by piece. His days revolved around his children, the simple routines giving him a renewed sense of purpose. In the mornings, he was the first to rise, slipping into the kitchen to make breakfast. His son and daughter would come running in, sleepy-eyed but smiling. They laughed more now. He could see the joy returning to their faces, and that filled him with a strength he hadn't known he had. One afternoon, while his kids played at the park, Carson sat on a bench watching them with a calm satisfaction he hadn't felt in a long time. As he watched his daughter's laughter as she went down the slide, he noticed a familiar figure approaching, Jason, an old friend he hadn't seen in years. They exchanged surprised glances and soon they were shaking hands, the past years melting away in an instant. Carson, Jason said, clapping him on the shoulder. Man, I can't believe it. It's been what, 5, 6 years at least? Carson replied, grinning. Life, you know, sometimes it just takes you in unexpected directions. Jason nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. Yeah, I heard about, well, everything. I'm sorry. Carson shrugged, but the gesture didn't carry the bitterness it might have months ago. It was rough, but we're getting through it. They sat and talked, catching up on old memories, swapping stories of the past, and even sharing a few laughs. Jason introduced him to a few of his friends in town, and over the weeks, Carson began to expand his world beyond just work and home. He'd almost forgotten how much he enjoyed spending time with people who valued him. One weekend, Jason invited him to a small gathering, and Carson hesitated. Socializing wasn't something he was sure he was ready for, but after some coaxing, he agreed, sensing it was time to open himself up to life again. When he arrived at Jason's house, a warm, welcoming hum of laughter and chatter filled the air. There was music, food, and drinks, but the atmosphere was relaxed. Friends who valued simplicity, who valued one another. As Carson settled into conversation, he noticed a woman at the edge of the group. She was chatting with Jason, her laughter warm and genuine. They caught eyes for a brief second, and he felt a flicker of interest that surprised him. Jason noticed the exchange and walked over, gesturing toward her. Carson, I want you to meet Sarah, he said, nudging him slightly. We grew up together. She's been out of town for a few years, but just moved back. Carson extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Sarah. She shook it with a smile. Likewise. Jason's told me a lot about you, she said. Oh, all good things, I hope, he said, smiling back. Mostly, she teased, and they both laughed. Carson was taken aback by how natural it felt, how easy the conversation flowed. They spent most of the evening talking, sharing stories of their pasts, their goals, and their experiences. Sarah didn't shy away from asking about his life, and he found himself talking about his kids and his decision to leave his marriage without bitterness. Her kindness and honesty were refreshing, a stark contrast to the world he'd left behind. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Carson grew closer. She didn't try to fix him, and she didn't pity him. She just listened, and that was more than he'd had in a long time. They spent weekends with the kids at the park, picnics on sunny afternoons, and quiet evenings watching movies at his place. With her, he felt seen and appreciated. One chilly autumn evening, after the kids had fallen asleep, Carson and Sarah sat on his porch with cups of hot tea, wrapped in the warmth of shared silence. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly, her eyes kind and thoughtful. He looked out over the darkened yard, considering her question. Leaving, I mean, she nodded. Everything, walking away, choosing this new path. Carson thought about the heartache, the betrayal, the months of wondering if he had made the right decision. But then he thought about the laughter of his children, their growing confidence, and the quiet peace that had settled over their lives. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the right thing." She reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You deserve this peace, Carson. You and your kids both." For the first time, he realized that he truly believed it. He deserved happiness, and so did his children. As months passed, life began to feel whole again. The betrayals that had once haunted him were now just echoes of a distant past, lessons that had strengthened him. His children had adjusted beautifully to their new life, and Sarah had become a warm, comforting presence in their lives. On one particular afternoon, Carson was at the park with his kids, helping his daughter with her bike as his son played on the swings. He was laughing, encouraging her as she tried to keep her balance, and out of the corner of his eye, he spotted two familiar figures across the field, Marissa and his mother, watching him from a distance. They looked hesitant, almost lost, standing there like ghosts from another life. Carson's first instinct was anger, but it passed as quickly as it came. Instead, he felt a calm resolve. They had made their choices, and he had made his. Without another thought, he turned his back on them, refocusing on his daughter, who was beaming with pride as she finally managed to pedal on her own. "Look, Daddy," she called, her face glowing with joy. "I see you. Keep going," Carson shouted, his heart swelling with pride. He glanced over at Sarah, who was cheering on his daughter with as much excitement as he felt. As they wrapped up the day and headed home, Carson felt a deep sense of contentment. He had moved forward, and he had found people who valued him and shared his values. His life was filled with love and laughter, with honest, meaningful relationships. The shadows of his past, once so heavy and painful, had faded into nothingness. And though Marissa and his mother remained on the outskirts of his life, he no longer felt bitterness. He wished them peace, hoping they would find it in their own way. Later that evening, as he tucked his children into bed, his daughter looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, are we happy now?" Carson smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart, we're very happy." He kissed her forehead and turned off the light, closing her door softly. As he stepped into the hallway, Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. Together, they walked to the living room, where they sat together in comfortable silence, each content to simply be in the other's presence. The past was behind him, and the future stretched before him, filled with possibilities he hadn't dared to dream of before. Carson knew that there would be challenges, but he also knew that this time he wasn't facing them alone. He had built a new life, one anchored in trust, respect, and love. And as he looked at Sarah, he felt a quiet, unshakable certainty that this life, this happiness was only the beginning.